welcome for those of you who have just now been able to join us this evening. It's good to see you all. I'm Dr. Kendra Clayton, President of the Graduate Theological Foundation, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for the 2017 Lord Robert Runcie Convocation Lecture. In the spring of 2000, following the death of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Robert Runcie, the Graduate Theological Foundation established the Lord Robert Runcie Convocation Lecture Series in honor and recognition of the loyalty and support he showed as head of the Church of England to the Graduate Theological Foundation's work in ministry education. It is an honor for me to introduce to you the 2017 Lord Robert Runcie Convocation Lecturer, the Reverend Canon Dr. Hugh Page, Jr. Dr. Page is Professor of Theology and Africana Studies and Vice President, Associate Provost, and Dean of the first year of studies at the University of Notre Dame. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree with a major in history from Hampton University, a Master of Divinity and Master of Sacred Theology degrees from General Theological Seminary in New York, a Doctor of Ministry in Applied Ministries from the Graduate Theological Foundation, and a Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy degrees in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from Harvard University. His particular research interests include early Hebrew poetry, theories of myth, the cultural content and ethnological criticism of ancient Near Eastern texts, Africana biblical interpretation, poetry as medium for theological expression, the use of religious traditions and sacred texts in identity construction within the Black community, and the role of mysticism and esotericism in Anglican and Africana spiritualities. Dr. Page is the author and co-author of many publications and is a fellow and the Benjamin E. Mays Professor of Scripture and Applied Ministries at the Graduate Theological Foundation. He is also a Research Associate of Human Relations Area Files at Yale University. I am honored to introduce to you this evening Dr. Hugh Page.
Good evening. Arthur Michael Ramsey, the 100th Archbishop of Canterbury, affirmed in the vein of the late Anglican divine Richard Hooker the value that Anglican theology places on ecclesial tradition, intellectual engagement, lived experience, and liturgy. For Ramsey, it is, quote, to the sound of church bells, end quote, that the process one of his notable predecessors, Anselm, described as faith seeking understanding, should take place. Today, theology, particularly that subdiscipline dealing with the practice of ministry, must be mindful of sounds echoing from a more disturbing soundtrack that includes the at times muted voices of faith communities struggling to define themselves in light of shrinking congregations and fiscal resources, the cries of those marginalized because of their religion, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, country of origin, or citizenship status, and a cacophony of public truth claims that makes it difficult to articulate and move toward a shared vision of the common good. Those doing research on and/or engaged in the allied disciplines of ministry need to be proactive and creative in responding to this evolving 21st century soundtrack. This evening, I hope to outline some possible strategies for so doing. Needless to say, I am honored by the invitation to deliver once again the Lord Robert Runcie Lecture for the Foundation. When last I was before this congregation, it was May of 2008. My talk then was entitled, Engaging Sacred Texts in an Era of Globalization, Toward a New Hermeneutical Paradigm. In it, I offered a rationale for employing a hermeneutic of love in the reading and application of the Bible and other authoritative texts as a means of fostering interfaith understanding and social cohesion. My remarks today build on those of almost a decade ago, insofar as they reflect the belief that what in a more ancient setting was termed the cure of souls grows out of a dynamic conversation between the texts we read, the liturgical and other traditions of which we are guardians, and the various social settings in which we live and work. As a seminarian in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and New York City during the late 1970s, I was surprised by how much of our professional formation was compartmentalized and largely disengaged from the world. The curricula were inclusive of the core and ancillary disciplines of theology. We had coursework in pastoral care and church and society. We had CPE and required field placements. Nonetheless, we were shielded to a great extent from the particularities of city life. The walls, the fences, and wrought iron gates of those institutions separated us from and shaped to a great extent our perception of the fraught urban landscapes in which we were embedded. The implicit message seemed to be that success as a student and future ecclesial leader depended on orienting one's gaze inward rather than outward, on conformity to denominational culture and school-specific norms. We students learned early on that rewards, in the form of good grades and recommendations, were tied to, of all things, obedience. Some of us also discovered that calling too much attention to the permeability of institutional barriers and the shortcomings of a theological education consciously excluding subaltern perspectives could be professionally perilous. Thus, it was to the sound of chapel chimes and authorized hymns that our preparation for ordination was to take place. Recognition of their resonances with medieval divines and classic theological tropes was deemed a marker of giftedness, a key qualification to receive the imprimatur for the practice of ministry. It was all too clear to me then, and remains so now, that the soundscape for what the Graduate Theological Foundation terms, quote, service to the improvement and nurture of society and the world community, end quote, must be more varied, and we as practitioners and scholars must be far more attentive to it. For those of us hoping to become fully adept practitioners of ministry, oriented broadly towards social enhancement, one that is in keeping with the vision of the GTF, we must develop the capacity for listening attentively to a veritable wall of sound, whose finer instrumental textures, in a metaphorical sense, must be separated and comprehensively analyzed. Unfortunately, this will be a challenging process, in no small measure because our ability to disambiguate requires a set of critical tools not typically taught in seminaries, and for which room may not officially be made in some of our faith communities. The challenge this presents necessitates the development of ancillary proficiencies that augment core competencies for the kinds of work we are each called to shoulder. It also requires the creation of opportunities and spaces for such attentive listening and critical disambiguation where our ministries, in fact, take place. Now, I suspect that Archbishop Ramsey, Archbishop Runcie, and their peers would be surprised by our American religious landscape in this second decade of the 21st century, one in which a substantial demographic in the United States, that is some 23% of the populace, reportedly profess no religious affiliation. According to one estimate, if the population in the U.S. consisted of just 100 persons, 46 would be Protestant, 21 would be Catholic, 2 would be adherents of other Christian traditions, 2 would be Latter-day Saints, 2 would be Jewish, 1 would be Muslim, 1 would be Hindu, 1 would be Buddhist, 2 would be devotees of other faiths, and 23 would be unaligned. Ramsey and Runcie would probably be pleased with the growth of Anglicanism in the so-called Global South, but chagrined by the recent acrimony within and fragmentation of the Anglican fold. Whatever their take on the place of the Episcopal Church within the Anglican communion, my sense is that they would note its precipitous decline in active baptized members from 1,923,046 in 2011 to 1,779,335 in 2015, a decrease of 7.47%. I think they'd also be struck by the downturn in median average Sunday worship attendance from 65 to 58 over the same period, a decline of 10.76%. Both of these realities would be a concern. They might even wonder what the parameters for Episcopal, presbyteral, diaconal, and lay ministry should be in a national church where the majority, 60%, of its 6,510 congregations had 200 members or less in 2015. They would no doubt wrestle with what the gospel mandate for those in the Christian extended family in America and around the world ought to be in a place where roughly 10%, 1 in 100 of the world's population is displaced and living in diaspora. Moreover, one can't help but surmise that both would find disturbing the incivility characteristic of discourse, theological and political, in certain sectors purportedly focused on the shaping of a common life in which our planet and its resources are cherished and sustained. I think they would be shocked that in place of learned debate, supported by sound data, we have in many instances infotainment laced with invective and partial truths. I have no doubt that both Ramsey and Runcie would be dismayed by a post-industrial American soundscape in which silent carillons, imperiled subaltern voices, and alternative facts predominate. But friends, what does it mean to do theology with such apparently discordant music playing on one's intellectual Spotify list? How does one effectively juxtapose such living poetry with the chorus of voices found in the various authoritative texts and traditions that are touchstones for the work we do among the faithful commended to our care and the planet for which we are stewards? What are its immediate and long-term implications for the theory and practice of ministry across the spectrum of traditions represented by those of us gathered here this evening? Needless to say, we cannot, we should not fast forward or skip to other more pleasing emotive tracks, though the temptation to do so is, in so many instances, great. Asking questions such as, why and how our existing American religious landscape has assumed its current shape. What factors here continue to endanger the lives and well-being of those considered marginal, expendable, or other in our society? And even whence our norms for modern storytelling and news reporting have been derived is important, yet dangerous work. Such queries, as we all know, tend to rankle. They call attention to the incongruities that self-congratulatory and triumphal narratives of American exceptionalism tend to conceal. They cast doubt on the wisdom of uncritically embracing a myth of national origins, cleansed of its less than salutary dimensions. They force us to acknowledge that ministry involves, in part, equipping ourselves and those we serve with the intellectual tools requisite for identifying and wrestling with such issues that might well challenge the status quo. Questions of this kind also urge us to reassess the priorities we establish for ministry, as well as our understanding of the nature and function of local gatherings of the faithful. For example, the advent of the 7-day work week, the erosion of leisure time, and the increase in dual career relationships and domestic partners managing households in multiple locations, these things have had a more than subtle impact on how Americans utilize their weekends. It is no longer a foregone conclusion that Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays will be reserved exclusively for activities centered on family bonding and/or worship. Neither can it be assumed that local faith communities, with few notable exceptions, will be the matrices of social life in their respective locales. Given the new economic normal and the sizable number of those religiously unaffiliated in our country, we should perhaps not be surprised by the relative quiescence of bells calling the community to daily worship, marking the passage of time, or even signaling the transition of the saints to the larger life. For many congregations, the exigencies of month-to-month survival assume primacy of place. For some larger religious bodies, my own among them, figuring out how to educate and support ordained clergy, many of whose cures are likely to be part-time and contingent, keeps them in crisis management mode. In such an environment, great is the urge to evoke a time when circumstances were different and to develop strategies aimed at reclaiming a glorious past. However, one wonders if it might not be more prudent to tarry, as my elders used to say, tarry for a while in the messiness of the moment, to listen more closely to those who have chosen not to define themselves in religious terms, to consider the opportunities for reconceptualizing the broad contours of ministry, to think through, even while confronting the pressing needs of the day, how to maximize the conditions in which, to quote the late Robert Runcie and Basil Hume, each person is equipped, quote, to follow with the utmost sincerity his or her conscience with the aim of seeking and obeying the truth, end quote. Admittedly, this may strike those bent on applying strategies to revitalize local congregational life, fill the pews, and increase pledges as counterintuitive. However, it also acknowledges that the crisis of the moment may in fact be an invitation to work with others engaged in ministry, to foster communal wholeness, and focus on social ills that impact people across creedal boundaries. Some seeking to be heard and in search of their truths are those for whom Christian and other traditions have not proven to be meaningful conversation partners. This group is surprisingly complex and difficult to paint with broad brushstrokes. Within it, for example, are those defining themselves as spiritual, though not necessarily religious, as well as disaffected or former adherents that have experienced inexplicable or tragic life circumstances that their communities and or leaders have been ill-equipped to address. Also to be included are those within the African American community who, like award-winning author Ta-Nehisi Coates, reject the biblically saturated dream language that fueled the civil rights movement and prefer, understandably, to keep their eyes squarely set on the harsh realities that devalue and endanger Black bodies. We need, in fact, to listen to all that have been denied a place in the American mainstream, and especially to those that live in fear of persecution or harm because of their gender, because of their race, because of their ethnicity, because of their sexuality or their place of origin. It could be argued that those imperiled voices are as important as those we give pride of place in our respective faith communities because of their antiquity or their canonical status. By so doing, we may even generate buy-in for projects that strengthen interfaith relationships and promote the common good. Finally, ministry today must also be attentive to the issue of information usage and management. Promoting human development and social well-being requires that we be able to weigh in on and equip those in our care to sift through ubiquitous news, near news, social media posts, and information from a host of competing outlets. Given the impact that such sources can have on the shaping of public opinion and on our day-to-day interactions with fellow citizens in the world, it seems incumbent on those engaged in ministry to consider how to empower people of conscience to measure the validity of truth claims and to tell the difference between facts, plausible assertions, and opinions. Now, one possible place to begin such a process is with an honest assessment of the historical evolution of our own beliefs. That is, with religious education that extends considerably beyond catechesis. Another starting point might involve exploring the deep longing for transcendence and for interconnectedness that some would argue is part and parcel of our genetic inheritance as humans. Either approach would help gradually reinforce the notion that places of worship can also be sanctuaries of learning. The disciplines of the heart and the habits of the mind inculcated in such an environment should be seen as fully transferable to daily life. We need not fear that the development of curiosity and critical thinking skills will scandalize the faithful. Equipping those among whom we exercise our charisms for ministry to join us in developing those critical capacities better to understand ourselves and our world actually enriches the intellectual and spiritual resources on hand to engage in those dimensions of our work that are truly transformational and life-affirming. Fides quaerens intellectum. Faith, seeking understanding, accompanied by the peculiar sounds of a fraught American landscape, demands of us a willingness to probe why the belfries in many of our urban centers and elsewhere are silent. It asks that we hear and respond to the anguished cries of Tanisha Anderson, of Sandra Bland, of Freddie Gray, of Walter Scott, and other victims of police violence. It urges that we hear the voices of the scores of women and men fearful this night of deportation, and those that have lost their lives in dangerous journeys across the border just south of us or in the Mediterranean to find safety in new homelands. Faith-seeking understanding urges us to create collaborative ministries that are inclusive of our sisters and brothers in other faith traditions, and that foster spiritual and intellectual maturity rather than dependence. Faith-seeking understanding in an era when social and political advantage is often brokered through divisive rhetoric may well inspire us to hold in abeyance those concerns that have long divided us, and affirm, with of all people, the late Prince Rogers Nelson, that the only love there is the love we make. May that love be our guide in ministry and in life. There is no other hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Page, for that inspirational message this evening. We have a few minutes for questions. Dr. Page said he'd be happy to take a few. So if you have any questions right now, now is the time, and then we'll break for the reception. Okay. Thank you. You feel them.
So I think it's interesting to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, along with some of the work of a scholar like Anthony Pinn at Rice, who himself was raised in the AMEZ tradition and later became a secular humanist, and argues that a number of those values that can, in a sense, help to reinvigorate our social life do not necessarily have to be derived from embrace of a theistic cosmos. I think Coates is an interesting case in point as well. I mean, it's obvious that he has a slightly different non-biblical vision of the love ethic that is a love ethic just as powerful. When you think about the purpose of the writing of that book, that it's addressed to his son, that he wants his son to understand the harsh realities of the world that he is about to be an adult in. I think that you can see there the same kind of passion for life that one can derive from other kinds of discourse. For example, the discourse of Martin Luther King Jr., where the dream is the focus and the realization of a new social reality is the work toward which we all strive. And Coates' argument that perhaps the vision that we need more fully to embrace is one that acknowledges the danger that black bodies face. So I don't think that they're all that different in terms of their fundamental embrace of the importance of life. I do think that the separation happens in terms of what you consider to be the grounding of that ethic for action on behalf of the community and the individuals that are a part of it. What I'm suggesting in my remarks is that it's an invitation to reimagine what it means to do ministry with a non-sectarian understanding of that process and that vocation. So orienting that task toward what, for example, our School of Global Affairs at Notre Dame calls integral human development. If ministry is reconceptualized as a process in which we create opportunities to build community and to nurture individuals and social aggregates toward that goal, that means that we can, in a sense, explore the possibility of making that the primary aim, and those resources that enable us to understand how to do that, the focal point, the principal conversation partners in both formation for ministry, in the development of liturgies, in the creation of opportunities for cooperation across denominational and faith boundaries. So I think that this is a unique invitation to do that. And of course, it's not going to be easy or fully embraced by everyone, because I think when you see or when you sense that there is diminution within your own ecclesial community, within your own faith community, the natural tendency is to figure out how you stop the hemorrhaging, how you bring people back, how you build up congregations, how you return to what used to be the norm and the status quo. And I think maybe this is an invitation for us to say or to think about what new possibilities that we perhaps may have thought of fleetingly, or that we may not have taken very seriously in the past, to take those up and to figure out where we might go with them. So I've been a part of the somewhat contingent clergy force. Over the past 13 or 14 years, I've been not really a certified interim at a parish, but a person who did supply work on a long-term basis on a handshake arrangement and was paid Sunday to Sunday. Right now, I'm a transition priest at another parish where they're in the process of searching for a full-time rector. I think that there are opportunities to think about how you make peace with the resources that you've been bequeathed. If you're in an urban environment and you have been bequeathed by those who have gone before you a major building with problems, in some sense you have to think immediately about how you establish the funding necessary to take care of the building's expenses week to week. On the other hand, if that's the only thing about which you think, then ultimately I think there's a lost opportunity to be creative in terms of engaging the larger community in which that building and that congregation might be embedded, and thinking about ways of reaching out and ways of defining the congregation and its members that do not require one to focus on money-based programming. What happens, for example, if you begin a low-cost, low-overhead series of initiatives, conversations, exploratory gatherings, opportunities for people to use the parish and its facilities as a gathering place to talk about shared community responsibilities and challenges? And what happens if the congregation itself begins to do some serious thinking, and this is very, very hard, about what the long-term possibilities are for them in that space? So it may be that the hard conversation about downsizing has to take place, because the congregation ultimately is not the building. The congregation is ultimately the people. But the building holds memories. The building The building, in a sense, holds the spirits of the people who have gone before. But if a place can think about how you make that transition so that the spirits and the memories are transferred to the people, and so that the mission of the place can continue, I think all kinds of possibilities emerge. It might well require learning another language. That's a completely different way of thinking about the longing for connectedness and the desire for transcendence and immanence. And traditional modes of theological discourse don't do well in engaging in that kind of reflection, or at least they traditionally have not been. And so I think we have to figure out how to engage those that are sharing these experiences with us, to pick up on the tropes, the key themes, and then to go back to our respective traditions and figure out how to bring them into conversation, how to translate what we consider to be key themes and make them not necessarily fit, but how to bring them into conversation with a different worldview and a different language. I think we also are going to have to rely on some sociological research that suggests that overall, I was reading an article that was published by the Pew Charitable Trust probably earlier last year, in which one author is suggesting that the number of nuns between now and 2060 globally is likely to decrease, because those who are professing no religious affiliation tend not to reproduce at the level of those who profess religious affiliation. So we may be looking at a sea change over a 20 or more year period. And so we need to have some predictive mechanisms that enable us to deal not just with the immediate circumstances we face, but also to plan for perhaps a shift into yet a different way of thinking about immanence, transcendence, and connection in the next generation. So, I think that all of us find ourselves brought up short at one point or another in trying to do this kind of work. And I think we each have to find our level of comfort. I preach just about every Sunday. And I struggle with how much I can say without losing those that I'm trying to reach. And having that always in the front of my consciousness keeps me from doing the easy thing, which is, it won't preach, don't do it. But figuring out a way, even if it's with a side remark or a provocative assertion, introducing a source that many of those in the congregations where I preach may never have heard of. Pitching sermons and other things that I write or present in ways that send a very subtle signal that theology belongs to everyone, and that it is at times a rigorous, extraordinarily difficult process that may not lead to absolute answers, but may generate questions, which are actually more life-giving, is what I try to do, and what might actually be a reasonable way forward. I think we each understand our respective contexts better than anyone else. And so we have to do, in a sense, a cost-benefit analysis, and also, at the end of the day, be comfortable with what we've done when we look in the mirror, and realize that some days we'll be able to say we've done well. And other days, we'll have to say we fell short. It might. And that's an uncomfortable thing to acknowledge. You know, to some extent, I think about why that had to happen to a great extent in the creation of the first independent black denominations in this country. I think about St. Thomas African Episcopal Church, born out of the Free African Society in Philadelphia, the choices that Absalom Jones and Richard Allen had to make, and the struggles that they encountered trying to put the interests of free blacks in the North in front of what were established ecclesial practices for the mainstream churches. I try to imagine what it must have been like for them being dragged from their knees in prayer at St. George's Methodist Church, which I'm sure to those who did the dragging was perfectly reasonable, given their understanding of their mandate for privilege, and how the kind of reimagination of the gospel requirements for service to others, for love, for forgiveness, had to assume primacy of place in terms of their own reimagining of their ministerial responsibilities. And they continued to be friends. They helped to establish the first Masonic lodge in the city. They both participated in one another's ordinations. I mean, they were doing things that reimagined ecclesial boundaries. And so I think we're at a point where it might actually be really productive to think about how that might play itself out in the 21st century. I think in reimagining ecclesiology, you reimagine theology. I don't think that those two branches can actually be separated one from another. They reimagine what it meant to be a community. In some ways, they erase the artificial boundary that existed historically between Methodism and Anglicanism. And in a sense, I think the Free African Society as locus may well have become the creative matrix that always remained with them, that stimulated all of their work, in spite of the fact that ultimately one chose to hang his hat with the Church of England and its American branch, and the other chose to hang his hat with John and Charles Wesley.